Now, if you weren't confused enough in our discussion about links, I'm going to add something to all of that. I'm going to now talk about symbolic links, which are, if possible, even more widely used than regular links, so they're at least, if not more, important. So what is a symbolic link? Well, it's all the same sort of thing. We're trying to create new ways to get to existing files, again for the purpose of convenience, but it's done in a slightly different manner. All the links we've mentioned so far are called hard links. That's just the term that we use for them. The word hard doesn't mean anything in particular here, and we use the term hard link to distinguish the links of that type from symbolic links, which is what we're about to discover here. So, what is a symbolic link? Well, to create a symbolic link to a file means that you're creating another small file, another separate file that contains nothing but a reference to the original file's file name. Confused yet? Okay, I'll see if I can clear it up for you. As far as symbolic links are concerned, there certainly is a thing called the original and a link to the original. With hard links, we don't have that. All links are considered equal with hard links, but with symbolic links, we have the original file, and then we have a link to the original file. And the link to the original file is, of course, the symbolic link. So the symbolic link is really another file. It's a separate file, and all that separate small file contains is a reference to the original file. And here's the important part. It contains a reference to that original file, whether or not that original file even exists. Now that might sound weird, but it's possible to have an original file, then create a link to that original file, then delete the original file, and the link that you created, the symbolic link, still remains. So if the original's gone, what is the symbolic link a link to? Well, it's not a link to anything really. It's an invalid symbolic link. If you try and access the file, you'll get some kind of error message, but the point is it can still exist. I'll show you a diagram in a moment that I hope will clarify this for you. Here's something else that may clarify it for you. Microsoft Windows also has the concept of a symbolic link. However, Windows does not have any concept of a hard link. When Microsoft Windows talks about symbolic links, they don't use the term symbolic links, of course. Instead, they use the term shortcut. Now, if you don't know what a shortcut is in Windows, you probably use them all the time. They are the icons that you see, say, on your desktop, or you can have little icons in other places as well, but if you see an icon on your desktop and it's got a little arrow in the bottom right-hand corner, a little curly arrow in the bottom left-hand corner of the icon, that indicates that that particular entity that you're looking at is a shortcut to some other file, or perhaps some other program. And a shortcut is a very small file that simply contains the name of another file. Why don't I actually show you? Here's a typical desktop, and you'll see that some of the items on this desktop, such as this one, and all these ones up and down here, they are regular, normal files that happen to be stored on the desktop, whereas these three here are shortcuts. In particular, I've got two files that are both Microsoft Excel worksheets. One is called Monthly Budget, and that's actually stored here on the desktop. That's where the original file lives. Whereas this other icon here has got a little arrow in the corner of it, indicating that this is in fact a shortcut. It's not a regular file at all. If I want to find out where the regular file is, I have to right-click on it, go to Properties, and then I find that it is a file called Timesheet in My Documents. That is where I'll find the real file. This is just an icon that represents that file. So, to use Unix terminology, this is a file, whereas this is a symbolic link to that file. I hope that makes things a little clearer as to what symbolic links are. So, moving on. If you want to create a symbolic link, you simply use ln-s. I'll show that to you in a moment. And to distinguish a symbolic link from another sort of file, you use, just as before, ls-l, where symbolic links are indicated by an L file type. The very first letter on the ls-l line is an L instead of a dash, which indicates symbolic link. Again, I'll show you that in a moment. Before I do, I just want to show you a diagram that will hopefully explain the relationship between symbolic links and regular files. So, do you recall this diagram? We have two file names that both point to the same inode, which then of course in turn points to the given data in the block. And I said before that both of those original file names back in the original directories were both hard links to the files. Well, now I'll pretend that the second one is no longer a hard link. I'll just take it away. So now we only have a single link to a given file. And what I'll do now is I'll create a symbolic link from one file to another file. And that looks like this. You can see that the file on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, circled in red, is actually now a symbolic link to the file above it, circled in blue. There are no references to inode numbers or blocks. It is simply a reference to a file name, in the same way that that little Excel icon was simply a reference to an Excel spreadsheet called timesheet in the My Documents directory. So let's see now how we go about creating symbolic links. You recall that I said if I use the ln command with the -s option, then I can create a link, say from sample.html. What will I call the link? Well, I'll just call it symlink. I press enter, now I do an ls-l, and I find a very interesting little phenomenon here. Notice I have over here an L in the very, very first column on that line, which indicates that this is a symbolic link. That's what the L means. You can tell that a file is a hard link if it's got a link count over here, but symbolic links are determined over here with the L. And notice also that all symbolic links have full permissions. The permissions on a symbolic link are not actually determined by the link file itself, they're actually determined by the permissions on the original file. Other things that are interesting is the file size is only 11 bytes, and 11 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 bytes. So all that file contains is a reference to sample.html, and you can see that by the use of the little arrow here. So can we actually use that to get to sample.html? Let's have a look. If I do a little vi of symlink, I should end up inside a sample.html. And let's put a little marker here to make sure that we know that we've come to the right place. I'll just put a few X's at the beginning of the file, then I'll quit out, and then I'll vi sample.html, and I find those X's are there. So I did actually manage to modify sample.html, and I modified it by accessing through a symbolic link. Or in Windows terminology, I accessed it through a shortcut. So why would we actually want to use a symbolic link? For that matter, why would we want to use a symbolic link instead of a hard link? Well, let's consider that example I spoke of earlier, where the receptionist is keeping a master list of all the extension numbers in the company in a file in her directory. And her directory is perhaps /home/users/marge /files/lists/phone, or something like that. And for convenience, you've decided that you're going to create a link to that in your home directory. And you do. And you think to yourself, ha ha ha, aren't I very clever? I will now always have the latest version. I'm much smarter than all those people that just copied the file into their home directories. But what happens if good old Marge, the receptionist, has been preparing another version of that file? She's been working on it, she's got a whole bunch of improvements, modifications, etc. And she's been doing that in a separate file. She hasn't been touching the original because she didn't want to impact anybody's life. And then at some point she decides that the new version is ready to go, so she deletes the old file in her directory and she puts the new file in its place with the same name. My question is this: what's happened to your file? Well, there were several links to that original file, and you had one of them, and she deleted her link, so your link is perfectly okay. You can still access all the data in that file. However, she has simply put a new file into the same place in her directory, and that new file has nothing to do with your file. It's a completely different file, so it's a completely different inode. And you carry on assuming that you have got the latest version, when all along there's a newer version in a completely separate file in the Secretary's home directory. So things quite have not gone as you planned. Now, if you were using symbolic links, if you created a symbolic link to that file in her directory, you would still be perfectly okay, because she would have deleted the original file but put another file back into the same place with the same original name. And because your symbolic link is only a reference to the file name, you're still perfectly okay. Let's see if I can't simulate that in this directory here. I'll just list the contents of this directory again. Now, I've got a symbolic link, do an ls-l, I've got a symlink is the file that points to sample.html. So now I will remove sample.html, which is similar to if the secretary deleted her file, her original file, and maybe she then created another file called sample.html, and she created, this is the new version, and she put that in the same place with the original name. Now you do an ls-l. Notice that the symlink, symbolic link, is still there. It hasn't been deleted because the original was deleted. The symbolic link still exists, and it's still pointing to a file called sample.html. So let's see what happens if I do a vi of symlink. Let's see if I actually end up inside the new version of the file. Aha, this is the new version. So if the secretary deleted her file and replaced it with another completely different version but used the same file name, you'd still be perfectly okay. So in this sort of scenario, it's actually better to use symbolic links. Symbolic links are actually very, very widely used in Unix, more so even than hard links.